I'll talk today about the internet as a cultural forum, implications for research. And it grows out of a couple of different ongoing projects that I have, primarily a European comparative project that I'll talk a little bit more about. But I like to start with the common perception that we are all being bombarded with increasing amounts of information and communication through the internet and through mobile media about something like this, that we are in some kind of funnel, we are embedded and immersed in all kinds of communication through devices that we bring with us, that are mobile, through online terminals, and that this is changing the nature of our everyday lives and the ways in which communities live their lives. That's common perception that we live in some kind of information or communication or network society. What I'll try to do in this presentation is to present an ongoing project that tries to address that sense of the changing social and cultural circumstances departing from Europe, but with implications for other contexts as well. So I'll talk a little bit about an EU project that I'm part of called Transforming Audiences, Transforming Societies. It has no less than 33 countries, 280 participants, and it's a sort of framework program where we do partly empirical studies, partly theory development, and various kinds of policy outreach, for example, in the area of literacy, including media literacy. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the research design, the point of departure for the study, the 9-country comparison that we're currently involved in. We didn't manage to persuade all 33, but then, okay, now we're 9 countries. That should work. And then I'll try to open up the presentation toward the end toward the question of comparative communication studies across time, but also across cultural contexts and across the continents. And I'll try to say a little bit about the ways in which, at least in my own field, which is media and communication research, there's been this shift of attention away from what used to be referred to as mass media and mass communication onto something that we currently call media and communication. I mean, if you look in journals and newspapers, these days you will rarely see reference to mass media and mass communication, but you will see a lot of reference to media and communication. And as far as my field is concerned, we're still trying to work out what does the "and" mean. So I'll look forward to our conversation here today. I understand that we are in an entirely interdisciplinary group, so I hope you will come in along the way also with questions, comments, protests, as you see fit, because I'm sure that will stimulate our interaction. Okay. The project, first of all. This project is part of the many schemes of the EU that try to support research in various fields, including the social sciences and the human sciences. It is a so-called cost action that brings together people from many different countries with a common research focus. In this case, the media with special reference to the audience, or whatever we should call that. We could also speak about users, we could speak about publics, and a common perception these days is that the users of the media have become more active, more interactive. We can do all kinds of things online that we could not do in the age of newspapers, television, broadcasting generally. So this, for a good number of scholars around the world, has raised this question of, what is being changed, what is being transformed, and what are the forces behind this transformation. As far as the transforming audiences is concerned, we're of course interested in finding out how big is this change really. You can find perceptions regarding the internet that this is really going to change everything. The availability of information, the potential of people to communicate among themselves. So in this area you find a lot of utopias, but you also find a lot of dystopias, concerns, for example, about surveillance. But to what extent are audiences being changed, in what respects, and not least, how are people interacting with different kinds of media? And perhaps most important, to what extent are people combining different kinds of media for the purpose of their everyday lives, whether in their private lives, in their professional lives, or in their various forms of social engagement. The second element of the title, Transforming Societies, suggests that somehow the communicative activities and the available media in a given society will affect the structure of society and the potential agency, what people can do in that given society. And what we're especially interested in is the way in which different societies may be changing in different respects, at different rates, so that we examine the development of communicative practices in different cultural contexts. The purpose of this element of the wider action that I direct is to produce a common baseline of communication practices that can be used both in the policy outreach and theory development of this particular project, but that will also be available for other projects to build on in the future. And toward the end, I'll come back to some of the deliberations that may also be of interest to you in terms of what do you do after the project is over? How do you share findings? How do you share data with a view to the future for the purpose of comparative studies in the future? Just to let you know, these are the countries participating. As mentioned, we would have liked to have an even larger number of countries, but we managed to have a good spread of countries as far as the European context is concerned, north and south, east and west, and as is often the case in EU projects, Israel is also among the participants. It's a very interesting and challenging job to coordinate among these different, not just academic cultures, but also intellectual and cultural cultures, and I'm enjoying it a whole lot. The project has as its objective, as I said, to create this baseline of how do people use media and what are the patterns of communication that they engage in across different media. Given the fact that countries are quite different, we agreed on a sort of dual structure where on the one hand we have a cross-national core of questions that are asked in each country that will make specific comparisons possible. So we had to agree among the 9 countries that we would pose particular questions in a certified translation. But in addition to that, each of the participating countries have had national modules where they might use this cross-national core, stand on the shoulders of that, and add particular interests that they had. Some people were interested in the use of media in political election campaigns. Others were interested in gender issues. Again, others were interested in generational issues. And even in some cases, there were several of these modules that could be compared among 2, 3, or 4 countries. One of the assumptions that we're making is that as far as our field is concerned, there's been a tendency to be very focused on the media themselves, to be concerned about what can new media do to us as individuals and as societies, and to be centered on the media institutions as such. One of the most common statement also in a wider public concerning the media is Marshall McLuhan, the famous Canadian's old statement that the medium is the message. That if you communicate through a particular kind of medium, that in itself carries a message. If I read about the ongoing developments in the American Congress, it's different than watching certain individuals in that Congress speak on television. Increasingly, people in that field are beginning to question the media centrism and to say, given the many different kinds of communication that new media, especially the internet and mobile media, facilitate, perhaps we should move from a media-centric to communication-centric approach to the field. One of the ways of doing that is to address some of the basic prototypes of communication that there are. We have one-to-one communication. It's sort of the prototype of communication as far as many people are concerned. What is communication? That is talking to each other, often one-on-one. But there's also, for the last several hundred years, one-to-many communication, mass communication in the form of the book, the press, film, broadcasting, and so forth. And the reason why we are currently having many of these discussions about changing media and transforming societies is that we now have a potential for new forms of many-to-many communication where many people can communicate among themselves in network structures, with the classic examples being social network sites such as Facebook, but also blogs, online games, Wikipedia, and so forth would be examples of this new potential. It's also important to note that it's not that the old media are dying. It is true that around the world, especially the press, the printed press is currently suffering, but many of the functions of the old media are being taken over by the new media in various patterns of communication that we can recognize. For example, watching television is often something done these days on tablets or on computers, so that the very activity, the very conception of watching television has been changing and has suggested to us the importance of looking at communication patterns or communicative practices rather than looking at each medium separately. So the methodology that we are employing is one that I developed together with a colleague originally for a study in Denmark. So what I thought I'd do is to give you a sense of how we're going about this. What is the research design? What did we find in the case of that very, very small country of Denmark, of 5 million people? Yes, we speak Danish. And then open it up to the research design where we benefited from some of the insights and findings there, applied it to the European context, and then go on to some of the implications. Our point of departure is the assumption that there are 6 prototypes of communication. 6 communicative practices. Along one dimension we have, as I mentioned, one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many communication, and we make also a distinction between asynchronous and synchronous communication. There is a real difference between hearing the voice of your loved ones and receiving a text message from those same people. Both can be nice, but there's a real difference to the quality and the implications of that. There is also a real difference between watching broadcast radio and television and watching a recording the next day. And there is also a real difference between having an online chat with friends or, for example, in the academic setting, having a Skype conference, negotiating problems of a project or who will be hired for a given position, and having exchanged information about this in an asynchronous format. So our, you could say, theoretical point of departure is the assumption that there are these 6 prototypes of communication that we then operationalize in terms of how do people use these different kinds of communication, text messaging, books, newspapers. Yes, people still do read books and newspapers. To what extent do people actually engage in the kind of very active uses of new media that is often talked about in public debate? The hope that the internet may support democratic activities, not just in countries such as yours or mine, but around the world. A familiar example is the so-called Twitter revolutions in the Middle East. Well, I mean, this has been studied. Twitter had something to do with it. It facilitated certain kinds of activities in Egypt and elsewhere, but it would certainly be an overstatement to say that Twitter made the revolution. So the question that we're trying to address here is, how do these different kinds of media become embedded in the social uses that people would like to make of them, and to what extent do people, for that reason, devote their time to these different kinds of communication? As a point of departure, or as an overview, we tried to make an index of to what extent are people engaging in these basic forms of communication combined. And I have 2 different slides about that. I will emphasize one because it's more basic and it's simpler to understand. Not that you are not able to understand complex matters, but because we have little time and because there are so many disciplinary differences. Okay, we might have an expectation, if we listen to public debate, that communicative practices are moving somewhat away from old-fashioned mass communication and in this direction. At least in Denmark in 2008, that was not the case. That's the first slide. That's the second slide. So these are index figures, and I'll be happy to talk about the niceties of how we computed that. But let's stay with this one. This figure essentially says that people engage in asynchronous communication one-to-one to a very high degree, to synchronous communication one-to-one to a medium degree. That is, we text a lot, we speak to some degree. When we go to one-to-many communication, old-fashioned mass communication, although broadcasting may be experiencing certain forms of crises, the time use, the time spent by people, the time resources that they actually devote to this activity is still high. And the one-to-many communication in the asynchronous format, recordings, DVDs, Netflix, and so forth, will be at the medium level, whereas the many-to-many communication is still at a low level. Now, this may be because of Danes, or it may be because of 2008 that things have been changing. But we took this as, a suggestion that we have to be careful when we make generalizations about the kinds of changes going on as a result of new information and communication resources being introduced into a society. So we wanted to know more. We would like to follow up on this, and we would like to study it in a comparative perspective. The opportunity to do that arose then in the context of the EU project. Skip that. In order to explore the implications of changing media uses further, we wanted to address some additional comparative issues. The basis of our study was still time used per medium, and I should say, just as a methodological aside, what we're relying on here are online surveys with a representative sample of the online population in each of these countries. And for those of you with a special interest in methodology, yes, there is a problem with the representative sampling once we do go into online surveys, because not everyone will be online, and in the countries that we're dealing with here, there will be different levels of penetration of the internet and so forth. We're aware of that issue. We're trying to compensate for it, and if you're interested in discussing that, we'll be happy. I'll be happy to discuss it. But for now, I'll just suggest to you that we have representative samples of the online population in these 9 countries, and we're able to compare in each case the comparative national statistics to assess our findings in this regard. More important, perhaps, we're interested in going beyond the level of just the time use, the attention or time resources spent on communicating in different ways, and looking at things like, well, what does television viewing mean, as I mentioned previously, or what are the kinds of functions that people actually use on their mobile phones? What are the kinds of genres that people use when they go on the internet? To what extent are news, games, chatting, blogging, and so forth important? Further, in addition to demographics, we're interested in issues such as how does the use of media and people's communication among themselves relate to the time of day. There's sort of a 24-hour cycle of different media. There always has been. For example, in European countries, where until quite recently television was something broadcast in the evening. Yes, that was the case. It was not 24 hours a day. We had sort of radio as a morning medium and television as an evening medium. And one of the currently interesting issues is not only how is the morning and evening medium distribution changing, but to what extent are people distributing these new forms of media across their day, and also in terms of location. Where do people use the media? Because we're so used to thinking of mobile media as something that you bring with you, so that you can, when you're on the go, you can send a text or an email or call someone. But one of the primary uses of mobile media is at home. Also outside the living room. Also in all kinds of other rooms. And we want to study them because it tells us something about the way in which new media and communicative practices are being embedded into everyday life in new ways. We also try to move a little bit away from the media centrism of much earlier research by posing, which is difficult in the survey context, but by posing people questions concerning what would you do if you were to do this particular thing. For example, contacting an old friend that you had lost touch with, or changing the time of a meeting. Would you typically use a phone, an email, and so forth, so that we sort of reverse the perspective and say, we all often have to do these kinds of things. Which medium would be yours for this particular kind of purpose? And this is just, I think, scratching the surface in terms of how media is integrated into everyday life. So that's the second element of what I'd like to say, that we are trying to extend the original research design, trying to re-emphasize the integration of different communicative practices in everyday life, and we're trying to compare these activities not just across time but also across cultures. When we're talking about email use in Croatia, or in Israel, how does that compare to Denmark, for example? Okay, let me then try to open up from the project itself. No, I don't have any findings yet from the entire European project. You'll have to do with the Danish findings. That could be considered in this context a pilot. You're all invited to come to Ljubljana, Croatia, in February of 2014, where we will have findings for you. And with the link that I'm getting to you later, there is an opportunity to attend, and it's an open conference in the sense that you can submit proposals for papers. So it's not a sort of we will tell you what we found, but it's a two-way conference. So you might want to consider that. I thought in this last part I tried to open up the question of how this relates to the overall changing environment, this notion that we communicate one-to-one, and we used to also communicate a great deal one-to-many, and now we communicate many-to-many. How do these different kinds of communication relate to each other? And that question has been at the forefront of media and communication research since the 1940s, with North America at the forefront of that research. It has to do with steps of communication, so that communication is often a multi-step process, not just in the sense that we interact, but that we pass on information to each other. The original term that some of you may have come across is the two-step flow of communication. I say there are 3 steps, because it's been a long time since the 1940s. The two-step flow of communication in my field has been one of the most influential models of communication. In one sense, it's simple, but in another sense, it is quite complicated and has interesting perspectives in it. Okay, the point of departure for my field, media and communication research, was the concern that the media would have massive impact on the individual, especially in the context of politics. Media and communication research grew out of 2 world wars, and a concern with propaganda, and a concern that people might be persuaded to do things through the communications coming to them through the media. The propaganda model has been a very strong one, a very strong concern, and also if you look at public debate, there's commonly a concern about the ways in which media can make people do things. I mean, you only have to think about high school shootings in North America. One of the first things that comes up was, did he play video games? So these kinds of associations are often raised, and I don't mean to diminish the importance of that, but simply that this is on the agenda and something that we need to study. One of the first and trend-setting studies in that field was done in 1944. It was Lassesfeld and et al. In 1944. They examined the American presidential election campaign in 1940, tried to find out how do people make up their minds. The book was called The People's Choice. Leaving the title aside, how did people make up their minds about who to vote for? This was later extended to other areas such as fashion or other preferences, and the upshot of those studies during the 1940s and 50s was that there is an indirect effect of communication as the primary aspect that we need to look at. In this case, political communication, where communication moves in 2 steps from the media to so-called opinion leaders, who then, in a second step, influence people in their local environment, communities, families, and so on. So it's sort of a small group approach to communication. That does not mean that in order to be an opinion leader, you have to be really smart and well educated and rich and so forth. An opinion leader is just the person who calls the shots in a given social group. So it's a general phenomenon. The conclusion that came out of that study was that at least we need to look at the complexity of communication processes, and perhaps we do not need to be as concerned as at least some researchers and policymakers were originally concerning the direct impact of the media on people in terms of the attitudes they have and the actions that they later perform. That understanding of the media is what is sometimes referred to as the magic bullet theory of communication, or the hypodermic needle theory of communication, so that the media sort of injects attitudes and actions into people, and then they will do that. Some of you may have read about the embedding of Coca-Cola commercials in a screening, which was later shown to be a fraud. So this notion that that people will run out after the commercials, grab a Coca-Cola just because they saw a Coca-Cola commercial is wrong. So, of course, as in all fields, things are a bit more complicated, and one way of conceptualizing that has been to say, well, it at least moves in two steps, and often in the area of political communication, we have to think about not how people form their attitudes, but we have to talk about agendas. One of the main documented functions of the media in the area of politics is agenda setting, so that we are taught through the media which topics to pay attention to. This is the agenda, not this. And therefore you're able, through the media, perhaps to focus people's attention on certain topics to the detriment of others. So that's the brief history of the field. The problem for the wider field of communication is that there's been a great divide between studies of mass communication and studies of interpersonal communication. And you might have thought, now that as I retell this story, everybody would be studying the connection between mass communication and interpersonal communication. Not so. It's actually two separate islands, two separate fields, which is too bad, and you can criticize my field for that, but a way of looking ahead instead would be to say, okay, let's now, where we are perhaps less concerned with the centrality of the media and more concerned with the interchange between different kinds of communication, let's return to the field and try to find out how these different flows are oriented toward people on different platforms and how they interact with each other. And that's where I say that is not two-step flow of communication. That is three-step flow of communication. So that what we used to be talking about up here was essentially the combination of mass communication being fed into one-to-one or small group communication settings. Those were the two steps. Now we have a third step. That step is different kinds of many-to-many communication, all the way from Facebook to Wikipedia. Some of you, of course, may be thinking it's very few people writing Wikipedia compared to the number of people who actually read Wikipedia. But the point would be still that this is a technological and institutional potential that you can actually have this many-to-many communication. So the three-step flow of communication is a way of saying that at least these three kinds of communication are possible in the kind of communication infrastructure that we have today. We need to begin to understand in much more detail how these different kinds of communication interact. To what extent Twitter revolutions are a fact, to what extent they interact with the kind of coverage of similar events that you have from CNN or Al Jazeera. The studies so far suggest that the role of one-to-many communication is still quite strong. If you look, for example, at the kinds of news items being exchanged one-to-many on various online services among ordinary users, and you try to trace that back, the origin is very often the established media. So it's not so that we could say that now everybody is a press. Now that everybody has the potential to communicate, everybody also has an equal say. It is still the case that the established media have the resources, both professionally and technologically, to gain a much better hearing than smaller, disenfranchised groups or even individuals. But the important thing would then be to try to understand how these things interact. What are the margins of indetermination? What are the potentials for having many communication be a part of the overall media environment? So one way of thinking about this, and for those of you who came yesterday, I apologize, you've seen this slide before, but this is an attempt to try to summarize all the different kinds of expression that we need to consider in the contemporary media environment. We have one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many communication. We also have different kinds of media. We have people just communicating with each other face-to-face. We have the old-fashioned mass media, and we have the new media, digital media, both in terms of telephony, old-fashioned web pages, and the kind of more interactive Web 2.0 types that are currently so much talked about. And as far as the three-step flow of communication is concerned, what I'm suggesting is that we need to begin to think about how these relate to each other as far as links between, say, this prototype and this prototype, this one and this one, and how they, in total, have an impact on the kind of communication that people engage in and the kind of information that people have available to them. I won't go through all the details of this. This is just to suggest an overall configuration of the kinds of media that we currently, at least in the West, have available in our media environment. So, just to let you know, how are we doing? We're doing okay. In the EU, we've completed our data collection. We're in the process of analyzing. This is the conference that you're all invited to. Maybe a little cold in Croatia in February, but still. So we'll have the findings ready there, and of course publish them as soon as possible. After that, and as I mentioned briefly along the way, we're interested in offering this as an open source resource. We would like to engage in comparative studies with others. We're in contact, in addition to Pew Internet, with colleagues in China. It would be an interesting three-way study for us to have Europe, North America, and China to compare in this regard. We're looking for funding, so if you know any foundations, that would be fine. One of the things, of course, in terms of financing, one has to look at is funding comes and goes. Statistical agencies stay in most countries. So that one way of thinking about getting good funding is to have an alliance with, there's a big organization called Eurostat, which is a collaboration among European statistical agencies, so that we have a plan of engaging them in a collaborative venture, because if we can't get continuous funding from research councils and foundations, like they might be a good collaborator. We'll see, but just to suggest that we're looking ahead toward more comparative studies. as I mentioned also, it seems important for these kinds of collaborative ventures to have agreed rules. So we've had everybody sign, no, we didn't have everybody sign a non-disclosure agreement, but we agreed that the data sets will live on. Others can use them. And we're sharing the data set in the project as a whole, and we are in agreement that the purpose of this project is not for profit research, but that it will live on, hopefully, in further longitudinal studies and other comparative studies, so that we're offering that baseline to other scholars, both in Europe and elsewhere, who might like to work on it.